Tarim Basin sent out a declaration of religious tolerance. Whoever submitted to the Great Khan would have their freedom of worship respected, a rather marked change from Wuchlug's policies. The region then erupted. Wherever Wuchlug had garrisoned troops, the citizenry fell upon them. Wuchlug was chased from city to city, many barring their gates to him. Fleeing the Tarim Basin, he traveled through the Pamir Mountains, eventually making his way through the rugged Badakhshan to the Wakhan corridor in northern Afghanistan, where he was cornered by local hunters and handed over to Zev. With Wuchlug's severed head on a lance, Zev paraded it through his territory and gained the submission of whichever cities still held out. Thus ended the Charakatai. Years of anarchy followed by a remarkably peaceful Mongol conquest. With hardly an arrow shot, Zev had greatly expanded the Mongol Empire westwards, returning to Genghis Khan in 1219 with 1,000 chestnut horses with white muzzles, the same color as the horse Zev had shot out from under him in 1202. Now, an unforeseen consequence of this conquest was that this brought the Mongol Empire to the borders of the Khwarezmian realm. Shah Muhammad had his own ambitions to conquer Charakatai and had succeeded in taking some of its western territory, only to suddenly have the remainder quickly fall to this rising power in the east, while encountering them on his northern borders. Yet this conflict between the Mongols and the Khwarezmians was not yet inevitable. In fact, Genghis Khan wanted to avoid, at all costs, war with Khwarezm. The first Mongol-Khwarezmian contacts were an embassy sent out by the Khwarezm Shah in 1215, passing the ruins of Zhongdu. Genghis was happy to generously gift them, a part of a general Mongol policy of overpaying merchants for their goods. With a surplus of silver ripped from North China, overpaying merchants was a fine way to encourage and direct trade in the difficult overland journeys, especially into Mongolia, and would be a hallmark of Mongol policy for the next century. Initial contacts seemed promising between the two states, and Genghis sent a return embassy in 1218 to reaffirm trade and friendship. By then, though, most of the Charakatai realm, the buffer state between the Khwarezmian and Mongol empires, had been ground down by the efforts of Shah Muhammad and Zev. Muhammad was perhaps eager to find fault in the embassy, led by Mahmud Khwarezmi, likely the same individual as Mahmud Yalavach, a significant figure under Ogadai Khan. The embassy's message from Genghis Khan said that the Khan considered the Shah on the same level as his dearest sons. The Shah was furious. How dare any man, even a great emperor, consider the Shah of Khwarezm a son, implying the superiority of the father? After the initial meeting, the Shah continued to grill Mahmud Khwarezmi, who, as his name describes, was a native of Khwarezm. Mahmud managed to calm him down by telling him Genghis's armies were pitiful compared to the mighty forces of the Shah, and that the Khan was only interested in trade. Shah Muhammad was pacified, for now. This embassy had been sent ahead of a larger, slow-moving trade caravan, about 450 merchants and their attendants, carrying precious goods. Sometime in late summer 1218, the caravan reached the city of Otrar, on the northeastern frontier of the Khwarezmian Empire. Otrar was governed by Shah Muhammad's uncle, Inalchuk, who, possibly on the orders of the Shah, or his own vile initiative, accused the merchants of being spies, seized their goods, and finally executed them, only a single camel driver escaping. This was a shockingly short-sighted decision. Even if Shah Muhammad didn't directly order it, he did nothing to discourage it or punish Inalchuk for the act. One possibility, suggested by historian Dmitry Timokhin, was that it was ordered by the Shah's domineering mother, Terkin Khatun, Inalchuk's sister. Terkin Khatun, a strong-willed woman of Changli origin, often actively combated her son's orders and acted as monarch in her own right in the original Khwarezmian capital of Gorganj. Perhaps seeing war as inevitable with the Mongols, with their swift conquest of Charagatai, she wished to force her son to act. Now, whatever the reason, it may surprise you to learn that the massacre of Otrar was not the direct casus belli for the Mongol invasion of Khwarezm. When that lone camel driver returned to Genghis Khan with news of what had happened, he was mad, but had no desire to lead a full invasion of Khwarezm, while the Jin were still unconquered, and the Khwarezmian army seemed fearsome enough on its own. Trade with Khwarezm was of greater benefit than conquest, so Genghis Khan in early 1219 sent another embassy, led by a Muslim who had served Muhammad's father and 2 Mongol notables. War would be averted and trade resumed, they told the Khwarezm Shah, if he only sent Inalchuk to Mongolia for punishment. As far as the Mongols were concerned, the massacre at Otrar was just the act of a short-sighted governor. Muhammad was in an unenviable position. If he didn't give up Inalchuk, war would come to Khwarezm. If he did give up Inalchuk, he would antagonize the Chipchak Changli officers in his empire loyal to his mother, Terken Khatun, pitting much of the administration and military leadership against him and undermining his rule. Thus, Shah Muhammad II of Khwarezm sided with his mother and made the fateful decision to execute the Muslim envoy, breaking the cardinal rule of diplomacy with the Mongols: do not kill the envoys. The envoy's Mongol accomplices had their beards singed off by Muhammad and were sent back to Genghis Khan. They returned to him after Jochi and Subutai had come with news of their own encounter with the Khwarezm Shah, and the message seemed clear. A powerful foe in the west, who now bordered his empire, had made opening strikes against the Khan. Ignore it and he would lose face while leaving his new western territory vulnerable to Muhammad's armies. With his general, Mukhali, having been committed to the Jin realm and able to keep the pressure on them, his northern borders secure and remaining rivals to steppe legitimacy destroyed by Jochi, Subutai, and Zev, Genghis Khan raised his armies and unleashed hell upon Khwarezm. Having explained the background to war between the Mongols and Khwarezm, you won't want to miss our next discussion on the Mongol invasions. So be sure to hit subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. For some years, I continued adverse from mentioning this event, deeming it so horrible that I shrank from recording it and ever withdrawing one foot as I advanced the other. To whom indeed can it be easy to write the announcement of the death blow of Islam and Muslims, or who is he on whom the remembrance thereof can weigh lightly? Oh, would that my mother had not borne me, or that I had died and become a forgotten thing ere this befell. Yet, withal, a number of my friends urged me to set it down in writing, and I hesitated long, but at last came to the conclusion that to omit this matter could serve no useful purpose. I say therefore that this thing involves the description of the greatest catastrophe and the most dire calamity which befell all men generally, and the Muslims in particular, so that, should one say that the world, since Almighty God created Adam until now, has not been afflicted with the like thereof, he would but speak the truth. For indeed, history does not contain anything which approaches or comes near unto it. Nay, it is unlikely that mankind will see the like of this calamity until the world comes to an end and perishes, except the final outbreak of Gog and Magog. For even the Antichrist will spare such as follow him, though he destroy those who oppose him, but these Mongols spared none, slaying women, children, and men, ripping open pregnant women, and killing unborn babes. So begins the famous excerpt from Ibn al-Athir on the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. Living in Mosul in northern Iraq, Ibn al-Athir was just outside the range of Mongol armies as they annihilated the neighboring Khwarezmian Empire in just a few short years. Daily, news must have come into Mosul of stories of Mongol devastation and atrocities, or how suddenly Mongol armies were operating hundreds of kilometers farther west than previously thought, or how they were now doubling back, terrified townsfolk wondering if Mosul was next. The writers who lived through the Mongol invasion, or just after it, such as Ibn al-Athir, Nasawi, Juzjani, and the most well-known, Juvaini, all describe the invasion in near-apocalyptic terms. The Mongols, a punishment sent by God. For how else, if not divine retribution, could one explain how every city could all fall so swiftly to these strange people from the north? Today, we present the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. I'm your host David, and this is the Ages of Conquest presentation of the Mongol invasions. In our previous episode, we discussed in detail the period from 1216 to 1219, after Genghis Khan returned from North China and entered into initial diplomatic contact with the Khwarezmian Empire. War between the Khwarezmian and Mongol empires came from three factors which occurred over this short period. The first was the breakdown and absorption of the empire of Chagatai, which had served as a buffer state separating the two empires. Mongol forces under Zhev Noyan took most of the eastern half of the empire, while the Khwarezmians seized the territory from the Fergana Valley in the west. The second was a battle between Mongol forces under Jochi and Subutai against the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II, sometime in late 1218 or early 1219. And finally, the massacre of a Mongol trade caravan at the Khwarezmian city of Otrar by its governor, Shah Muhammad's uncle, in Alchuk. An envoy Genghis Khan sent afterwards to try and solve the dispute was then executed by Muhammad. Coupled with the engagement with Jochi and Subutai, it seemed that the Khwarezm Shah had declared war on the Mongols, and with the fall of Chagatai, now shared a border with them in what is now eastern Kazakhstan. Though the Khwarezmian Empire now holds a reputation as a giant with a feet of clay, this would not have been apparent from Genghis Khan's position. The Khwarezmians controlled a vast territory. Originally based in the Khwarezm region in modern Uzbekistan, south of the Aral Sea, where their house's founder, Anushtagin Garchi, was appointed governor in 1077 by the final Seljuk Sultan, Mamluk Shah I. Anushtagин's successors expanded to incorporate Transoxania, central Kazakhstan, and south into Afghanistan, most of Iran, and even Azerbaijan, though much of this territory south of modern Turkmenistan had only been taken since 1200, and Khwarezm control was loose. Much of their military was Turkic, Chipchak-Changli peoples from the steppe, fighting in similar fashion to the Mongols, horse archers, heavy cavalry, and supported by various Iranian peoples as infantry. The Chipchak-Changli also made up a significant portion of the administrative and upper bureaucracy of the empire. Having spent the early 12th century as vassals of the Seljuks and then the Chagatai, the House of Anushtagin showed themselves to be consistently ambitious and treacherous. In the 1190s, Muhammad's father Tekesh, in alliance with the Caliph, defeated and killed the final Seljuk Sultan, Togrul III, allowing Khwarezmian expansion into western Iran, but beginning their rivalry with the Abbasid Caliphs in Baghdad. The disintegration of the Ghurids in 1206 brought Khwarezmian rule to the northwestern borders of India, and the collapse of the Chagatai due to Wuchlug's usurpation extended Khwarezmian authority east into the Fergana Valley. With this massive expansion of the empire in a 3-decade period, Khwarezm Shah Muhammad, ruling since 1200, could quite rightly feel he was among the most powerful sovereigns on earth, which may in part explain his haughty treatment of Genghis Khan's ambassadors. From the Mongol perspective, the Khwarezmians were acting antagonistically, and as a rapidly expanding empire, it seemed possible that they would try and seize the new Mongol-controlled territory of the former Chagatai. Internally, the Khwarezmian state was not as strong as it appeared. Since most of the empire was so newly taken, how reliable it would prove in the face of invasion would be questionable. The Chipchak Changli in the administration and military not only mistreated the urban Iranian population, but many of them were essentially mercenaries, or held more loyalty to Muhammad's mother, Terken Khatun, than him. Indeed, Muhammad and his mother were often at odds, and with Terken Khatun often issuing orders that conflicted with those of her son. Officers across the empire would receive contrasting orders from both, and would follow whichever arrived later. The antagonism between mother and son would hamstring the Khwarezmian defense. Neither had Muhammad's actions in the last 2 decades made him friends outside of the empire. From Baghdad to Delhi, the Khwarezm Shah had a reputation as greedy, unreliable, and driven to conquer. Few tears would be shed for him should he face calamity. Most of the contemporary sources lay the blame for the invasion squarely on Muhammad Khwarezm Shah, Ibn al-Athir for instance, directly citing Muhammad's conquest of the local kingdoms, leaving him as the sole defense as the reason for the speed of the Mongol conquests. Most sources also cite his treatment of the merchant caravan and envoys, and present the Mongol invasion as something he brought on himself, and was equally unsuited to defend against. With that background on Khwarezm and the reasons for the war between the two empires, let's get into the actual invasion, shall we? Genghis Khan made his preparations and set out in the summer of 1219. The general Mukhali, with 20,000 Mongols and several tens of thousands of Khitan, Jurchen, Chinese, and Tangut soldiers, was left to maintain pressure on the Jin dynasty, while Chinggis's brother Temugay was left with a small force to keep Mongolia secured. The remainder of all available forces were to be taken west against Khwarezm. This was not just Mongolian cavalry, but subject Wagyrs, Charluks, Khitans, and Jurchen horsemen, with Chinese siege engineers and doctors. 100 to 200,000 armed men are the common range for estimates, not including families and attendants who would have accompanied the army. Additionally, herds of horses and remounts for the soldiers, hundreds of thousands of sheep and goats to feed the men, and oxen and camels to haul wagons, gurs, supplies, and materials to construct siege weapons. The total animals brought may very well have approached 1 million. Orders had also been sent out for the Tangut to provide troops for the western campaign, but with the rise of the anti-Mongol minister in the Tangut court, Asak Gambu, they declined and told off the Mongol envoys. Now, this was not the cause for the later destruction of the Tangut, spoiler alert by the way, as it's often reported. The Tangut did provide troops for Mukhali's campaigns occurring at the same time, but it was the start of an insubordination, and finally independence, which would lead to the utter destruction of the Tangut state. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Shah Muhammad did not sit idle, and convened a war council at his new capital of Samarkand to decide the defense. One strategy proposed was by Muhammad's valiant son, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, who suggested the full might of Khwarezm should be levied and meet the Mongols in a titanic clash on the Sir Darya River, a formidable barrier where crossings would be limited. Muhammad balked at pulling all his garrisons north, for in their absence, his southern territories could assert independence. His fear at meeting the Mongols in open battle may have played a role as well. Ultimately, it was decided to spread garrisons across the major cities of Transoxiana, Khwarezm, and Khorasan, the northeastern frontier which would face the brunt of the Mongol assault, while Muhammad stayed south of the Amu Darya River to ensure the south of the empire didn't rebel. Though this plan has been criticized in the decades and centuries that followed, it wasn't totally without merit, just mostly. Attacks by steppe tribes were hardly new, but generally they lacked the siege equipment to take the walled cities of the region and would content themselves with pillaging the countryside. Muhammad assumed the Mongols would do the same, and in theory, a long march without succeeding in taking any cities would smother the flame of Mongol wrath quite quickly. Transoxiana, the region between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya, or Oxus and Jaxartes, as these rivers were known in antiquity, marked the most important geographic barrier to the Mongols in the northern half of the empire. Crossings over each river were limited, and much of the expanse in between them was marked by the harsh Kitsilkum Desert. There would be enough reason to expect that it would slow them down, and perhaps even prevent Mongol passage, or at least limit it to a few select routes, which could be guarded. Unfortunately, Muhammad didn't comprehend the significance of the experience the Mongols had gained in China from 1211 to 1215, or that they now came west with a large body of Chinese engineers to build their siege machines, or that if the Gobi Desert proved no barrier to the Mongols, then neither would the Kitsilkum. Genghis Khan's armies reached the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar in autumn 1219, where the trade caravan had been massacred. With strong walls and a stout defense, Genghis left a force to besiege Otrar, while his armies split and marched up and down the Sir Darya River. Otrar fell after a difficult 5-month siege, and its governor, Inalchuk, was captured. In famous tradition, when Inalchuk was brought before Genghis, the Khan saw fit to punish him by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears. It doesn't often pay to defy Genghis Khan. That the Mongol army split up after reaching Otrar proved a major issue for the Khwarezmian defenders. Had the full force stayed encamped outside of Otrar, waiting to starve it out, the possibility was there that the Khwarezmians could bring their weight to bear upon them. But now, with Mongol armies ravaging both up and downstream of the Sir Darya, while keeping Otrar under siege, it was impossible to combine against them. Further issues came when Genghis Khan himself suddenly crossed the Sir Darya and Kitsilkum Desert. It had been expected he would have to take the route directly to Samarkand, protected by a mighty garrison, while the Kitsilkum was thought too difficult for a large army to pass. The Mongols and their horses were sturdy, and they passed in winter with the assistance of local guides. In the early months of 1220, Genghis Khan had appeared behind enemy lines. The towns of Zarnuk and Nur were the first Khwarezmian settlements to fall, shortly followed by the major center of Bukhara. A sortie by the garrison was quickly destroyed, the citadel holding out only a little while longer. It's at Bukhara that Genghis Khan, for the first time we know for certain, entered a city and allegedly gave a famous speech, calling himself the punishment of God, if we are to believe Juvaini. Bukhara's population, particularly young men, were forced into the Hashar, a forced levy used by the Mongols essentially as arrow fodder. Driven before the main army, Mongol lances pointed at their backs, the Hashar would push siege equipment, fill in moats, and be sent against the gates and walls of cities. In these highly exposed positions, they soaked up arrows which otherwise would have fallen on valuable Mongol warriors. It served to frighten and demoralize the garrison and other populations. It made the Mongol army appear larger, and ground down a segment of the population most likely to resist later. Such multifaceted psychological tools were favorite weapons of the Mongols. The Hashar of Bukhara and other settlements on the route were driven to Samarkand, the chief city of the region and Muhammad's capital. With strong walls and a garrison of fierce Turkic warriors supported by war elephants, Samarkand would be a fearsome target to force. Genghis arrived before it in March 1220, where he was reinforced by his sons Chugadai and Ogadai, who had taken Otrar and brought the captive Inalchuk. 3 days into the siege, Samarkand's garrison rode out to attack the Mongols and were cut down to the last man. The city surrendered by the end of the week, its citadel holding out until a nearby dam was destroyed, its floodwaters undermining its walls. Craftsmen and artisans were put aside for Mongol service, women were taken as slaves, and the remainder were forced into the Hashar. Unexpectedly quickly, the jewel of the northern half of Shah Muhammad's empire had been snatched away. Near the ruins of Samarkand, Genghis divided his forces again, divisions crisscrossing across the empire. On the advice of a Khwarezmian defector, Genghis Khan had letters forged and sent to top Khwarezmian generals, making it seem that the Mongols were cooperating with Muhammad's mother, Terken Khatun. This further paralyzed whatever still remained of Khwarezmian leadership. Genghis Khan sent his generals Jev, Subutai, and Tokachi after Shah Muhammad, whose courage had fled almost immediately. As Samarkand burned, Muhammad fled south. Muhammad Khwarezm Shah spent the remainder of his life on the run, Jev and Subutai hot on his heels. Across Khorasan he rode, then northern Iran, where Terken Khatun was captured. He rode until December 1220, when the bedraggled Shah died on an island in the Caspian Sea, his final days spent suffering from pneumonia, awarding titles and lands to his sons, titles and lands that were no longer his to give. So ended the reign of Ala ad-Din Muhammad bin Tekesh, Shah of Khwarezm, whose actions signed the death warrant for many untold hundreds of thousands of people. Beside him had been his son, Jalal al-Din Mingbornu, who took his father's title and would lead a resistance against the Mongols. This was not the end of Jev and Subutai's great voyage, but we'll give that tale its own episode and focus on the main campaign here. Once Mongol armies crossed the Amu Darya, the southern river of Transoxiana, and Muhammad fled west, the fate of Khwarezm was sealed. The names of the cities change, the length of the sieges change, but the outcome rarely does. Cities that resisted were forced open, their garrisons massacred, their populations enslaved. For strenuous resistance, or the death of a Chinggisid prince, like that of Tokachi outside of Nishapur, then the entire population would be put to the sword, the city destroyed. These served as a stark message: resist and you will perish. In contrast, those who surrendered immediately were largely left untouched. Often they were ordered to dismantle their walls, provide food and tribute, and sometimes men for the Mongols, and accept a Mongol-appointed overseer, a Darukachi, Baskak, or Shana, as they were known in Persian sources. Beyond that, the Mongols cared little for the internal affairs of towns, and they were left to their own devices. If they revolted afterwards, though, as happened in Merv, a spectacular example would be made of them. It's from these cases where we see stories of towers of skulls made from the inhabitants. Did Genghis Khan at the outset intend on conquering the Khwarezmian Empire? It's hard to say. Certainly not even he would have anticipated how quickly the Khwarezmian defense would fail. Each city was essentially left to its own defense, ensuring the Mongols could surround and bring their weight to bear on individual sites. As Muhammad had fled, accompanied by Jalal al-Din, there was no one to organize any greater unity among the Khwarezmian emirs. After his father's death at the end of 1220, Jalal al-Din and his brothers returned to the mainland, making their way to Gurganj, the original Khwarezmian capital. There, Jalal al-Din attempted to organize things, but some emirs, even in this crisis, refused to recognize him, as Terken Khatun had wanted another of Muhammad's sons, a more malleable individual, to succeed him. With assassination attempts against him, Jalal al-Din abandoned Gurganj. Not long after he left, Jochi, Chagatai, and Ogadai surrounded and destroyed the city after a lengthy siege. Jalal al-Din fled southeast to Afghanistan, the former Ghurid territory which was his patrimony, and where Mongol armies had not yet arrived. There, he was able to gather an army of Changli, Charluks, Kalaj, Afghan, and Guris, perhaps 60,000 in total. Jalal al-Din was a capable general and led this army to defeat two Mongol forces. One of these, at Parwan, was a sizable force led by Shigi Chutchu, the Grand Judge of the Empire and Chinggis's adopted son. That victory at Parwan late in summer 1221 set off a series of revolts in Khorasan. Cities like Herat and Merv, which had submitted previously, threw off Mongol rule. Genghis Khan's youngest son Tului was sent to punish them severely for this. For Jalal al-Din, he suffered a catastrophic defection in his victory. A conflict over loot from the battlefield between some of his commanders led to one abandoning him, taking half the army with him. Unfortunately for the Khwarezmian prince, this coincided with Mongol forces converging upon Genghis to march against him. Jalal al-Din, now with only half of his army, was to face the full might of the Mongol invasion. Jalal al-Din attempted to flee to India, but the Mongols moved quickly and caught him on the Indus River around November 1221. The Khwarezmian prince fought fiercely, his army backed up to a cliff over the river. Commanding the center himself, even while his flanks crumpled under Mongol arrows, he held firm, but fate could not be avoided. With a final charge, he pushed back the Mongols, then spurred his horse around, and in full armor, spear still in hand, lunged off the cliff into the river. Mongol archers rushed to the cliffside to send arrows after him, but according to Juvaini, Genghis Khan personally ordered them to hold and watched Jalal al-Din and horse swim across the river to India. Then, turning to his sons, he said, "This is the kind of son that every father dreams of, having escaped 2 whirlpools, water and fire, and reached the bank of safety. He will commit many a glorious deed and cause innumerable misfortunes. How can a man of reason but reckon with him?" Genghis Khan always appreciated heroic acts, and Jalal al-Din, for his courage, earned the respect of the Khan. The other Khwarezmian soldiers were not so lucky, and those also trying to make the river crossing were sunk by Mongol arrows. The battle on the Indus River essentially marked the end of the Khwarezmian Empire. Though Jalal al-Din escaped and spent some years in India before making his way back to western Iran and resisting there, the state effectively ceased to exist. Most of Iran would be left in the hands of local dynasties for the next 2 decades. Khorasan left a ruinous buffer, while Transoxiana was absorbed into the empire, the threat of the return of Mongol forces hovering over all. It's impossible to say how many were killed in the invasion. Sources like Juvaini often give greatly inflated numbers for those killed in certain cities, recording 2.4 million killed at Herat, or 1.3 million at Merv, while another source gives 1.7 million lost at Nishapur. These numbers are certainly exaggerations, more to give an idea of total destruction than specific losses. It's doubtful that any city in the Khwarezmian Empire approached 1 million inhabitants, even when flooded with refugees fleeing the Mongols. Juvaini's work will also mention 1.3 million killed at Merv, then have the Mongols return not long after and find another 10,000 to kill. It's also hard to distinguish how many were killed directly from Mongol arrows or from the famine and spread of disease following the invasion. Many of the irrigation canals needed for sustaining agriculture around these cities were either directly destroyed or the people who had known how to maintain them had been killed and driven off. The starvation which set in following the reduction in agricultural production must have claimed many thousands. Beyond that, we have mention of internal fighting, cities using the Mongol invasion as a chance to carry out old grudges, and following the Mongols' withdrawal, the fighting between local dynasties, bandits and rebels would have claimed yet more lives. That many tens or hundreds of thousands of people were driven from their homes, fleeing the Khwarezmian Empire entirely, or carried back east as slaves, must not be discounted. Gaining a truly accurate tally of the dead is impossible, but easily at least 1 to 3 million people were killed during or because of the invasion. It left not just a physical and demographic scarring, but a mental one as well, the Mongols becoming a byword for incomparable calamity even today. It's no wonder so many sources present the invasion in apocalyptic terms, though efforts at recovery and reconstruction under Mongol rule will be something we will explore in future episodes. With Jalal al-Din Mingguru's defeat, Genghis began the slow journey back to Mongolia. The campaign had been a victory beyond his wildest dreams, and it's at this point that the Mongols likely began to develop the belief that it was heaven's will for them to conquer the world. For how else could one explain what had happened? Everywhere they went, military victories soon followed. The authority of Genghis Khan among the Mongols was near absolute, though he still had the matter of his succession to deal with, as well as unfinished business in northern China. Contrary to some statements, Genghis did not immediately turn about from the Indus to attack the Tangut. It was not until after 1223, with the death of the general Mughali, that the Tangut would openly rebel and earn their own destruction. Our next episodes will be discussing the great expedition of Zhev and Subutai through the Caucasus and battle against the Rus and Chipchak. The Khalkha River, as well as Genghis Khan's final years. So be sure to subscribe to Ages of Conquest, a Kings and Generals podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, David, and we will catch you on the next one. And thus, for our sins, God put misunderstanding into us, and a countless number of people perished. And there was lamentation and weeping and grief throughout towns and villages. And the Tatars turned back from the river Dnieper, and we know not whence they came, nor where they hid themselves again. God knows whence he fetched them against us for our sins. So ends the section in the Chronicle of Novgorod, which describes the first encounter between the Rus and the Mongols, the famous Khalkha River battle of 1223. Perhaps the most impressive feat of the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire was the so-called raid of Zhev Noyan and Subutai Batar, two Mongol generals whose pursuit of Muhammad Khwarezm Shah took them from modern Uzbekistan across northern Iran, through the Caucasus, then across the steppe to the Ukraine, fighting a combined Rus-Chipchak force on the Khalkha River in May 1223, before returning back across the steppe. For these generals, it was a journey through totally alien cultures, languages, and peoples, and that they met them with military success at almost every turn, with notable exceptions, is an impressive feat in itself. Considerable legend has built upon the Great Raid, like so much rust, so we're eager to strip this away, sharing recent historiography and shining a light on this expedition. I'm your host David, and this is Ages of Conquest, the Mongol Invasions. For background on this venture, we must point to our episode on the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, which, of course, you've listened to. Mongol armies reached the northeastern borders of the Khwarezmian Empire in modern Kazakhstan at the end of 1219, and by March 1220, had seized the capital of Samarkand and nearby Bukhara, and with their fall, the nerve of the Khwarezmian ruler, Shah Muhammad II, broke. Stationed in Balkh, just south of the Amu Darya, the final natural barrier to the Mongols, the thought of facing Mongol armies in battle was too much for him, and he fled west to Iran with a small entourage, including his son, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu. In Genghis Khan's long experience in warfare, he knew that should the enemy leader escape, he could rally disparate forces and strike back. This was something Genghis himself had done many times in his earlier career. The Khwarezm Shah could not become a beacon for resistance, and thus Genghis Khan sent his hunters in pursuit, Zhevnoyan, Subutai Batar, and Tokuchar Gurgen. Zhev was at this time Genghis Khan's top general, a daring and brave commander. Zhev led from the front and had a knack for long pursuits. Zhev had famously entered Genghis Khan's service in a rather unorthodox manner. Originally in the service of the Khan's enemies, in 1202 at the Battle of Koyaten, Zhev, then named Jircho Adai, shot and killed the Khan's horse. After the battle, Jircho Adai was captured and told the Khan that should he execute him, he would be useful to no one, but spare him and he would be his most loyal servant. Always one to appreciate acts of bravery and noting his skill with a bow, Genghis Khan took him and renamed him to Zhev, meaning arrow. Zhev distinguished himself against the Jin dynasty and then again against Wuchlug of the Chagatai, during which he almost single-handedly doubled the size of the empire, as covered in a previous episode. Zhev was the senior commander of the hunt for Muhammad Khwarezm Shah. Subutai is likely the most famous Mongol general, though in 1220 was far from the prominence he would later assume. Indeed, the following expedition forged Subutai into the iron-hard commander for which he was later renowned. His most notable command prior to this was alongside Genghis Khan's eldest son Jochi, sent against fleeing Merkits and unintentionally colliding with an army under the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad. Zhev may have been a mentor to Subutai in this pursuit. Each of them was in command of a tumen, in theory 10,000 men, though almost certainly these were undermanned. The man sent in support was Tokuchar Gurgen, Gurgen meaning son-in-law, as Tokuchar was married to the daughter of Genghis Khan, Temujin. Tokuchar's job was to consolidate those cities and towns which submitted to Zhev and Subutai's forces while securing their rear. The pursuit went at a fast pace. Shah Muhammad reached Nishapur in northeastern Iran as early as April 1220, but moved again once he learned that Mongol forces had crossed the Amu Darya. Zhev and Subutai, as they moved, took the submission of cities like Balkh, Sarax, and Nishapur itself in May. These cities were given a Mongol-appointed governor, ordered to provide tribute, food supplies, and to not offer assistance to the Khwarezm Shah. Those who resisted were bypassed for sake of speed, sending messages to Tokuchar to punish them. Nishapur was lightly treated, but soon revolted due to false rumors of a victory by Shah Muhammad. Tokuchar attacked them in November 1220, where he was killed by an arrow outside the walls. In spring 1221, Nishapur received a grim punishment for this action. Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, led a brutal retaliatory campaign and devastated Nishapur. Men, women, children, even cats and dogs were said to have been slaughtered. Tokuchar's widow, Temujin, took part in the massacre, wreaking havoc for her fallen husband. Back in 1220, after Shah Muhammad left Nishapur, he undertook a wild ride across northern Iran. Zhev and Subutai struggled to find his trail, splitting into two separate columns, which blazed across the country before reconvening at Ray, at present-day Tehran. During this period, Zhev captured Shah Muhammad's mother, Terken Khatun, sending her to Mongolia to spend the rest of her life as a prisoner. Muhammad's western flight was hampered by his conflict with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and with Zhev and Subutai closing the gap, he sped north to Hamadan. According to the Persian writer Juvani, the Mongols narrowly missed the Shah with their arrows at Hamadan, while another, Nasawi, records a battle fought between Muhammad and the Mongols. If Nasawi's account is true, that was the only time Muhammad led an actual battle during this entire campaign. Either way, after Hamadan at the end of summer 1220, Jev and Subadai lost Muhammad's trail. Muhammad had fled to an island off the coast in the Caspian Sea, down to a few followers and his sons. Delirious, mentally and physically exhausted, and suffering from pneumonia, Muhammad Khwarizm Shah died there in December 1220, his 20-year reign ending in a fire and a sea of blood. Jalal al-Din took on the mantle of Khwarizm Shah and returned to the mainland. The remainder of his story is covered in our previous episode. Jev and Subadai spent winter 1220 in Azerbaijan's Mugan Plain. Perhaps they soon learned of Shah Muhammad's death, as they began 1221 by attacking the local kingdoms, though our sources diverge on details. In some sources, during this winter, they sent messengers to Genghis Khan for permission to continue campaigning, while in others, they had received such permission at the outset. By February 1221, they were attacking the Kingdom of Georgia. We'll give a brief rundown on who the Mongols encountered here. The Kingdom of Georgia was the region's great power since the early 12th century, developing and expanding upon a strong military and fortress system established by King David the Builder. Georgian heavy infantry and cavalry had resisted repeated Seljuk invasions, while the mountainous country provided many natural barriers. Greater Armenia was under Georgian rule, as was northern Azerbaijan through Georgia's vassals, the long-reigning Muslim Shirvan Shahs. To the south of the Shirvan Shahs were the Ildeguzids, Seljuk appointees and longtime foes of Georgia, who a few years prior had recognized Khwarezmian overlordship. There was an independent Armenian kingdom in this period, though it was in southeastern Anatolia. This was the Armenian-ruled kingdom of Cilicia, and whom we'll meet again in future episodes. The Mongols moved quickly. In February 1221, they defeated a Georgian army before doubling back to Iran to deal with revolt among cities which had submitted. One of these, which was sacked, was Maraga in March 1221. At this time, Ibn al-Athir was living in Mosul, a city not far from Maraga. Writing a few years later, he records an interesting anecdote at Maraga, describing an unnamed Mongolian entering a house during the sacking, killing several people and taking more prisoner. Only when the Mongol removed their helmet, armor, and weapon to rest did the prisoners realize that their captor was actually a woman, then surprised and killed her. While we have a few cases of Mongol women partaking in battle, almost all were princesses or were avenging fallen husbands, like the aforementioned Temulun. This occasion in Maraga is perhaps the closest we come to a regular woman in the Mongol army. No other source mentions this anonymous woman or indicates any women of high standing marching alongside Jev and Subadai. Much of 1221 was spent pinballing across northwesternmost Iran and the Caucasus. Hamadan, Nakhichevan, Ardabil, Sarab, Bailakan, and others were all attacked. The Eldeguzid Atabeg of Azerbaijan, Ozbeg, ignored Georgian requests for an alliance and submitted to the Mongols. And later in the summer, they defeated the Georgian king, George Lasha, son of the famed Queen Tamar, drawing his heavy cavalry into a feigned retreat. George only narrowly escaped and died in 1223, leaving his kingdom greatly weakened. He was succeeded by his sister Rusudan, who ruled as regent for the next 20 years, marrying a Seljuk prince, but her kingdom suffered repeated depredations by Khwarezmians under Jalal al-Din Mingburu, and then the Mongols, who she reluctantly submitted to, and so ended Georgia's golden age. Jev and Subadai spent winter 1221 on the Mugan Plain again. Had they sent messengers to Genghis earlier in the year, by now they would have returned with orders and confirmed Muhammad Khwarizm Shah's death. It's probable that they were ordered north against the Chipchak Kumans, the nomadic Turkic peoples who inhabited the steppe beyond the Caucasus. The Chipchak Kumans had been an issue for several years already. Alongside Jochi, Subadai had fought them just prior to the Khwarezmian campaign. Chipchak Changlis made up much of the Khwarezmian military and had a long tradition of military alliance with the Georgian kingdom. In either of these realms, they had the potential to undo Mongol advances once Genghis withdrew. Since part of the Mongol Empire's legitimacy was based on its supremacy of the steppe, the independence of the Chipchak Cumans, a potential rival to that claim, was entirely intolerable. Perhaps even at the outset of the campaign, Zhev and Subadai had been ordered against them, but were not provided sufficient evidence to say that with certainty. In turn, that brings us to another point. Often, this part of the campaign is titled as the Great Raid, intended as one of exploration and intelligence gathering, and therefore a great success. However, this appears to be a creation of a more recent popular literature. As we've already described, little of Zhev and Subadai's actions differ from the ongoing campaign of Genghis and his sons in the east. A raid would not have been so concerned with subjugating cities and peoples, and the sources themselves generally refer to it as conquest. As mentioned, the Mongols had an enmity with the Chipchak Cumans for several years at this point. A major attack from an unexpected direction was always a favorite maneuver of Genghis Khan, and perhaps their conquest was in mind from the outset. In 1222, Zhev and Subadai began north again. In Shirvan, they attacked Shamakhi, where we find a particularly gruesome siege technique. Supposedly, they built a ramp from corpses of livestock and locals, fighting over the city walls until the ramp decomposed. Their next movements were halted by the great fortress of Derbent, guarding one of the main passages through the northern Caucasus to the steppe. Deeming it too secure, they asked its ruler to provide them with envoys to discuss terms. One envoy was killed, and the other forced to show the Mongols a difficult alternate route through the mountains past the fortress. Exiting the mountains, they entered into the base of the Volga steppe into Chechnya or Dagestan. There, they were met by an army of horsemen, Alans, a nomadic Iranian people who had inhabited the region since Attila the Hun, and the Turkic Chipchak Cuman tribes. It's quite possible the Shah in Derbent, the Georgians, or even merchants had brought news of the Mongol army wreaking havoc across the region, and they had prepared should the Mongols come for them. The Alan Chipchak army was too strong together, so messengers were sent to the Chipchaks with promises of sharing loot and gifts should they abandon the Alans. The Chipchak leader withdrew, leaving the Alans to be slaughtered by the Mongols, who soon caught the unsuspecting Chipchaks and fell upon them. Evidently, quite a number escaped, fleeing westwards, among them a notable leader named Kotchen, rising to prominence with the deaths of the two most powerful Kuman Khans in the battle. Kotchen had allies among the Rus princes far to the west. The Rus principalities were at that time infamously fragmented, inhabiting the cities of northwestern Russia, north of the Ukrainian steppes. These competing principalities, the most prominent being Veliky Novgorod, Vladimir, and Kiev, often relied on Kuman horsemen as auxiliaries for attacking their rivals, bartering for valuable Kuman war horses, and marrying into the Kumans for alliance. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, perhaps the leading Rus prince of the time, was married to Kotchen's daughter, and upon learning of the Mongol threat from his father-in-law, helped assemble a mighty coalition of Rus princes in the final months of 1222. With the fearsome Druzhina heavy cavalry of the Rus princes and skilled Chipchak Kuman horse archers, it was a formidable force. In a lovely coincidence, the three lead Rus princes of the coalition were Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, Mstislav of Chernigov, and Mstislav Romanovich, the Grand Duke of Kiev. The sources have an unhelpful tendency to just refer to Mstislav when discussing the army. As this force assembled in late 1222, Zhev and Subadai raided Crimea, sacking the port of Soldaya. Popular retelling has Venetian merchants ally with the Mongols here, sharing information on Europe and spreading Mongol propaganda in exchange for exclusive trade rights. Subadai then sacking their Genoese rivals at Soldaya. Such statements have no basis in history, however, emerging, it would seem, from a French work of the 1890s. Italian, especially Genoese, presence in Crimea and the Black Sea in 1222 was minimal. At this time, access to the Black Sea was controlled by the Latin Empire of Constantinople, supported by Venice, preventing Genoese entrance. Soldaia itself was an outpost of the Empire of Trebizond, another Byzantine successor, but as argued by historian Andrew Peacock, when the Mongols arrived at Soldaia in 1222, it may have been under the brief control of the Seljuks of Rum, taken as a part of their war against Trebizond. Either way, in 1222, Soldaia was not a Genoese colony. The belief in a Venetian-Mongol alliance emerging in 1222 must be a conflation of later Venetian prominence in Crimea and among the Mongols in the later 13th century, long after Subadai's initial raid into Crimea. No evidence from the period suggests in any form that Venice allied with the Mongols in the early 1220s. After this Crimean raid, Zhev and Subadai learned of the Rus Kuman army making its way down the Dnieper. Hoping to split this force up as they had the Alans and Chipchaks, Zhev sent an envoy who the Rus princes killed. Another envoy was sent with this simple message: "Since you have listened to the Kumans and have killed all of our envoys, and you are coming against us, come then, but we have not touched you. Let God judge all." From here, most modern retellings skip to the prolonged feigned retreat culminating on the Kalka River, a battle often presented as Subadai's masterstroke, second only to his victories in Hungary 2 decades later. However, there is a little-known skirmish prior that is often ignored, recorded by the Chronicle of Novgorod. As the Rus Kuman forces marched down the Dnieper towards the Mongols, on the other side of the river, a small Mongol scouting force was spotted observing them from a Kuman burial mound, a kurgan. The Mongols hadn't realized they were by a ford, and one of the Mstislavs, likely Kochin's son-in-law, and a Kuman force unexpectedly crossed and closed the distance. Surprised, the Mongols buried their captain, named Gemya Beg in the Chronicle of Novgorod, to hide him until they could return. But the Kumans uncovered him and executed him before Mstislav. This episode seems a minor skirmish, but a shocking interpretation has been proposed by historian Stephen Pau. Pau suggests that Gemya Beg was how 13th century Rus writer may have interpreted the name Yema Beg, which was the Turkic form of Zhev Noyan, suggesting this was the embarrassing capture and execution of Genghis Khan's star general. Allow me to explain while you settle from the shock. In most Western Asian sources, Zhev is referred to by the Turkic form of his name with Beg, Prince, the Turkic version of the Mongol title of Noyan. Zhev disappears during this campaign, last mentioned with certainty in the Caucasus, and his final fate unrecorded. This was hardly uncommon for Mongol generals, as the Mongols preferred not to discuss the deaths of their commanders. Some modern authors have tried to fill in the blanks, such as Zhev dying of illness during the return, but again, there is no medieval source which states this. Zhev was brave, often taking risks and leading from the front. Perhaps he had rode ahead to eye the Rus Kuman army himself. The Kumans recognized him and were very excited to have captured him. The episode stood out in the Rus chroniclers. They knew it was someone important who had been captured, but were not quite sure who or how important. So this puts a spin on what follows. If Zhev died on that kurgan in May 1223 and was Subadai's superior, then the famous 9-day feigned retreat Subadai led the Rus and Kumans on may have been an actual retreat. Suddenly thrust into command thousands of kilometers from any reinforcements, with a large enemy drawing down on him, Subadai needed to fall back and replan. So for 9 days, his army ran, the Rus and Kumans hot in pursuit. As they traveled across the steppe, Subadai saw the enemy force lose its cohesion, the Kuman riders pulling ahead of the Rus. Rather than face the full might of the coalition, Subadai could bring the full weight of his army to bear on only a fraction of the enemy. As they reached the Kalka River, Subadai's force turned about and fell upon the isolated Cumans, who routed. The Cumans fled, colliding with the Rus, who lost their battle order as Mongol arrows fell among them. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia lived up to his name by being among the first to run, making his way back to the Dnieper, taking a boat and cutting loose the rest, trapping the rest on the shore with the Mongols. A portion of the army under Mstislav of Kiev retreated to a nearby hill and built a stockade, holding out a few days until tricked into surrendering. It was promised that the blood of the princes would not be shed, so the princes were bound hand and foot and placed under boards as the Mongol command feasted and danced upon them. The rest of the army was slaughtered, though one prince was recorded as being brought to be executed before Jochi in 1224. Likely this was the fate of Mstislav of Kiev. The Chronicle of Novgorod says only 1 in 10 men returned from the Kalka campaign, and all indications are that losses were shockingly heavy. Yet that the Mongols quickly returned to the steppe took them out of mind. The Kalka disaster had little immediate impact on the Rus, other than the loss of several princes, and no preparations were made for their possible return. The Kuman Chipchaks likewise stayed fragmented, though Kochin Khan seemed to remain wary. When the Mongols returned in the late 1230s, Kochin was the Kuman leader who fled to Hungary. So why did Subutai not put further pressure on the Rus? Well, by now, he'd been on campaign for several years, and the size of his force must have been ground down. Further, if Zhev wasn't killed in the above-mentioned incident on the Kurgan, he did not long survive the Kalka battle, and his loss would have been demoralizing. Despite the victory over the Rus and Cumans, they had shown themselves dangerous foes, and Subutai knew that if he returned, he would need a powerful force. Thus did he begin the long trek back to Mongolia in the summer of 1223. Now, unfortunately for Subutai, this episode doesn't end there. While many popular retellings end on a triumphant account of the Kalka, on his way back east, Subutai's army was ambushed by the Volga Bulgars. It's a murky episode, and you'll find a lot of nonsense about it online. First off, who were the Volga Bulgars? The original Bulgarian nomadic tribes of the steppe were first mentioned around the 5th and 6th centuries. There was a brief period when they were the regional power in the 7th century, often called Old Great Bulgaria, under Khan Kuvrat. On Kuvrat's death, according to tradition, his sons took the tribes in different directions. One, Asparuch, took them to the Danube, founding the First Bulgarian Empire, assimilating into the local Slavic population and adopting Christianity. Another group traveled north to the intersection of the Volga and Kama rivers, and hence the Volga Bulgars. Famed as merchants, their cities were a vital trade point between the Rus cities, the Finno-Ugric peoples of the forests, and the Islamic world, and they were the northernmost outpost of Islam, which they had adopted in the 10th century. By the 12th and 13th century, they had an increasingly violent competition with the easternmost Rus principality, Vladimir Suzdal. With their extensive trade contacts among the Kuman Chipchaks and along the Volga, they must have known of the destruction of Khwarezm and the rough clockwise movement of Subutai's army, long making preparations for a possible confrontation. This battle is mentioned in brief in several sources, but only the Arab writer Ibn al-Athar, writing in Mosul in the early 1230s, provides any details, and it must be noted he may have been eager to play up any Mongol defeat. We do not know if Subutai was intending to strike the Volga Bulgars or was completely surprised by them, but somewhere along the Volga River, Bulgar forces ambushed him, drawing the Mongols into feigned retreats and striking them in the rear as their forces spread thin to high losses. According to Ibn al-Athar, Subutai was left with only 4,000 men by the end of the battle, though he then mentions that Subutai had strength enough to attack cities along the lower reaches of the Volga outside Bulgar territory, like Saksin, so we might question how accurate this number is. Zhev, notably, is not mentioned at all. And that's it. Though some modern authors like to write about Subutai then avenging himself against Bulgar forces further upriver, Neither Ibn al-Athir or any other medieval source makes such mention. It seems these modern statements arise from two things. One, confusion regarding highly influential French authors, Dossan and Grousset of the 19th and early 20th centuries, whose vaguely worded paragraphs on this section may have led others, blindly trusting them, to interpret a victory. And second, many authors just as blindly accept the legend around the undefeated Subadai, with source not easy to access to combat it. Maybe Subadai was defeated and forced to withdraw from Bulgar territory, though whether this was a minor or major loss, we cannot tell. This was not even the only military defeat we know Subadai suffered. Another came at the hands of the Jin dynasty in the early 1230s, the final victory of that once mighty kingdom. And so Subadai returned humbled and hardened from a several thousand-kilometer march across Eurasia. He brought with him information on the nature of the enemies in the west and an idea of the numbers needed to subjugate it. Gev had to be avenged, as did Subadai's pride, and in time Subadai would return with overwhelming force to crush the Bulgars, the Kuman Chipchaks, and the Rus. We are far from finished with the Mongol conquests, so be sure to subscribe to Ages of Conquest, a Kings and Generals podcast, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. You can also leave us a review on iTunes, which would help us raise our profile so we can keep this show running. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. Heaven has abandoned China owing to its haughtiness and extravagant luxury, but I, living in the northern wilderness, have not inordinate passions. I hate luxury and exercise moderation. I have only one coat and one food. I eat the same food and am dressed in the same tatters as my humble herdsman. I consider the people my children and take an interest in talented men as if they were my brothers. We always agree in our principles, and we are always united by mutual affection. At military exercises, I am always in the front, and in time of battle am never behind. In the space of 7 years, I have succeeded in accomplishing a great work and uniting the whole world in one empire. I have not myself distinguished qualities. So opens a letter from Genghis Khan in 1219, though he did not write it himself, as no evidence suggests he ever learned to read or write. He may have dictated much of what was written down. Emphasizing his nomadic background and lifestyle, his military qualities and extreme humility, it's easy to imagine this as part of the many ultimatums the Mongols sent to rulers across the world, demanding their submission by the will of eternal blue heaven. However, this was not sent to any monarch, but a Taoist sage, and the letter goes on to describe the graces of one Qiu Chuji, begging him to come and provide his wisdom and the secret to eternal life to Genghis Khan. The elderly Qiu Chuji agreed and made the difficult journey from northern China through Mongolia and Central Asia to finally meet Genghis Khan in what is now modern Afghanistan. In this episode, we'll relay to you one of the lesser known but possibly most intriguing episodes in the life of history's greatest conqueror. Not a military campaign, but a religious discussion, one which illuminates some of the personality of Genghis Khan. I'm your host David, and this is the Ages of Conquest podcast, The Mongol Invasions. As with many things in life, context is key. In 13th century China, the three most noteworthy belief systems were Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. Their history and how they intertwined and affected one another is fascinating, but to be honest, far beyond the scope of this episode. Each strongly influenced daily life and government in China, had done so for centuries, and still does today. They were not monolithic belief systems, nor singular ecclesiastical entities like the Roman Catholic Church, and various sects and trends impacted each system over their combined millennia of adherence. What interests us in this episode is a sect of Taoism which combined elements of Buddhist and Confucian thought that emerged in the mid-12th century, the Chuanzhen sect, meaning complete realization or complete perfection. Founded by Wang Zhe, a man who historical commentators have defined more for his eccentricity than sanctity, the Chuanzhen quickly became associated with prolonging life, perhaps indefinitely, through controlling one's internal alchemy, which includes, among other things, total celibacy. Thus, the Chuanzhen leadership, among them Qiu Chuji, were invited to the Jurchen Jin capital of Zhongdu in 1188 to share their knowledge with the ailing emperor, Shizong of Jin. The fact that Jin Shizong died the next year, and that Wang Zhe died in 1170 at age 57, did little to dispel the association. Qiu Chuji was among Wang Zhe's earliest disciples, and after the master's death became one of the sect's leading figures, eventually earning the title of Master Chang Chun. After Shizong of Jin's death, Qiu Chuji was largely confined to his home region in North China's Shandong Peninsula, and along with other Chuanzhen leaders, cultivated the sect's popularity until it became one of the most popular of North China and the Jin Empire. As we know, the 13th century was not a good time for the Jurchen Jin state, and Mongol forces invaded in 1211, quickly grinding down the empire. In this time, Qiu Chuji received invitations from both the Jin court and Chinese Song dynasty to the south, inviting him to come and share his knowledge. Both were declined. The sage may have been rather surprised when a messenger arrived from the Great Khan of the Mongols in 1219. But how did Genghis Khan learn of Qiu Chuji? That takes us to some interesting characters. One was Liu Zhonglu. His personal name was Liu Wen, and he was a Jin defector who happened to be Genghis Khan's personal Chinese physician and an herbalist also skilled in the making of whistling arrows. The Mongols prized men of useful skills as well as archery, so Liu Wen was a snug fit in the Khan's expanding entourage. It was he who heard of the Taoist sage and brought him to Chinggis's attention, having heard rumors Qiu Chuji was over 300 years old. He told the Khan that the Taoist would be able to share these secrets and prolong his life. The meeting was encouraged by another figure of growing influence, a Khitan scholar named Yelu Chucai. Chucai is worth a digression as he is among the most famous of the non-Mongolian administrators of the empire, though his importance would not come until the reign of Ogadai. The Khitans, you may recall, were a people related to the Mongols who had once ruled northern China during the Liao dynasty from the 10th century to the 1100s, before being conquered by the Jurchen-ruled Jin dynasty. Yelu Chucai was a distant relation of the Liao ruling clan, and his own father had been a personal attendant to Emperor Shizong of Jin. He would have followed in his father's footsteps as a highly educated, Sinicized servant of the Jin if it wasn't for the Mongol invasion. Stationed inside Zhongdu, the city of his birth, during the terrible final siege in 1215, Chucai was deeply traumatized by the intense suffering and horrors he witnessed. Had it not been for the 3 years of intensive Buddhist training he underwent following the siege, it seems unlikely he would have ever reared his head for posterity. But finding peace and purpose within the teachings of the Buddha, Yelu Chucai developed a steely resolve and determination to do his greatest to further reduce sufferings. In 1218, he was summoned to Mongolia, gathered in a Mongol search to find ministers to govern their new empire. As a Khitan educated in Chinese government, but of kin to the Mongols, he was highly prized. In April of that year, he met Genghis Khan in person, who was immediately impressed by the tall, deep-voiced, and long-bearded Yelu Chucai. The Mongols would call him Urtu Sakal, Longbeard. On meeting him, Genghis Khan stated, "Liao and Jin have been enemies for generations. I have taken revenge for you." To which Chucai responded, My father and grandfather both served Jin respectfully. How can I, as a subject and a son, be so insincere at heart as to consider my sovereign and my father as enemies? Loyalty to one's lord was something Genghis Khan valued above almost all else, and would honor the Khitan for this. So Yellow Chucai entered his service, acting in a variety of roles, including astrologer, advisor, and court scribe. Hearing Liu Zhanglu's notification of Qiu Chuji, Chucai encouraged the meeting, hoping the Taoist would be able to help pacify the Khan's more violent tendencies. It's likely Chucai drafted the letters to Qiu Chuji, though he would in time come to regret this. Was Genghis genuinely enticed by the idea of eternal life? As always, the personal thoughts of the man are unknown to us. Rarely did Genghis Khan ever find a single use for anything. While Qiu Chuji could bring the secrets to immortality, he was also a highly influential religious leader within territory that the Mongols wished to conquer. To have him on their side would prove valuable in both the spiritual realm, for his prayers could entice heaven's continued support for the Mongols, and in the physical realm, as to bring the many Chuanzhen followers into accepting and supporting Mongol rule would ease and consolidate the conquest. If a religious leader was unwilling to accept Mongol rule, then he must be destroyed. The implicit threat behind this would have been clear to Qiu Chuji when Liu Zhanglu arrived with Genghis Khan's message and 20 armed Mongols in late 1219. Declining was not really an option for Qiu Chuji, though he may have been eager to attach his name to the growing hegemon of northern China. Such an attachment would only strengthen the place of the Chuanzhen and save them from Mongolian retribution. Qiu Chuji and several disciples, protected by Liu Zhanglu and his men, set out in early 1220, traveling through the war-torn North China. We're rather fortunate to have one of Qiu Chuji's disciples record the journey for us. It's been translated to English twice by Emil Brettschneider and Arthur Whaley. Both are available to read for free online. Look up Brettschneider's Medieval Researches from Eastern Asiatic Sources or Whaley's Travels of an Alchemist if you're interested in reading the full, fascinating itinerary. In April, they reached the Mongol-occupied ruins of Zhangdu, now renamed Yen, where Qiu Chuji was received by ecstatic crowds. There, the party received unfortunate news, as Genghis had set out on the Great Khwarezmian Campaign. They were reaching Yen while Genghis was resting his horses near Samarkand, the fallen capital of Muhammad Khwarezm Shah. Qiu Chuji, understandably, did not want to make the long journey to Central Asia, but Liu Zhanglu would not have it and forced him on. Qiu Chuji's next stalling tactic was directed at the large group of young girls Liu Zhanglu was collecting to present to the Khan. For reasons relating to purity and celibacy, Qiu Chuji refused to travel in their company, and a perhaps flustered Liu Zhanglu sent a message to Genghis to inform him. They spent most of the rest of 1220 near Yen, awaiting the Khan's reply, when in winter messengers arrived from Chengis's youngest, and perhaps only surviving full brother, Temuge, who wished to hear his words. In February 1221, they set out again, having received the Great Khan's replies, one of which was a reminder for Liu Zhanglu to take the utmost care of the master. Before they departed, Qiu Chuji is said to have told his adherents in Yen that he would return in 3 years' time. Traveling north, they passed through the fortifications which the Mongols had broken through in 1211. Crossing the Yehuling, the site of the bloody battle of the Badger's Mouth Pass, they saw the ground still littered with bleached human bones 10 years after the engagement. Around April or May, the party reached Temuge's encampment in northeastern Mongolia. There, Temuge inquired about the secrets to prolonging life, to which Qiu Chuji told him it was improper for the prince to learn these secrets before the emperor. Getting the hint, Temuge supplied the travelers with oxen and carts to help them on their journey and hurry them along to his older brother. The voyage is of great interest to scholars as it provides a fascinating view of early Imperial Mongolia visiting the Orkhon Valley and encampment cities like Balashgun, where they met the eponymous Qingchai, a senior minister of the empire ordered to help expedite the journey. Jurchen and Tangut princesses that Genghis had taken as wives came out to greet Qiu Chuji, as did various Chinese who had been transplanted west to serve the Mongol war machine. Sadly, we don't have time to share all the details of the lengthy and difficult journey westwards, following roads cut by Mongol armies en route to Khwarezm, or at times forced to tie ropes around carts and animals to lift or lower them through passes in the mountains. Details of cities they passed by or through, like Beshbalik or Amalik, Urumqi, and the former Charakitai capital at Balashgun, are provided. In December 1221, they finally reached Samarkand, Qiu Chuji wintering in the palace of the late Khwarezm Shah. Likely at this time, he met Yalo Chutsai and spent time discussing religion and philosophy. Judging from the writings of Qiu Chuji's disciple, the master found great pleasure in Samarkand, particularly in its gardens, describing them as finer than those in China. There, he noted that Samarkand had a quarter of its former population, but had been repopulated somewhat by Chinese, Khitans, Turks, and Tanguts, who had traveled with the Mongol army. The party stayed in Samarkand in comfort until April 1222, when a Tangut messenger from Genghis arrived, bearing a letter for Qiu Chuji that read, "Sainted man, thou hast arrived from the country where the sun rises. Thou hast met great difficulties in crossing mountains and valleys. Indeed, thou hast taken great pains. I am now about to return, but I await impatiently for thine explanation to me of the doctrine of the Tao. Do not delay meeting me." At this time, Genghis was making his steady way north after his victory over the Khwarezmian prince Jalal al-Din Mingburnu in November 1221 on the borders of India. Qiu Chuji met Genghis Khan somewhere south of the Amu Darya River in what is now Afghanistan on the 22nd of May 1222, where the Khan was overjoyed that this old man had made such an arduous journey to meet him. After allowing him a meal, the Khan asked rather bluntly, "Sainted man, you have come from a great distance. Have you a medicine of immortality?" To which Qiu Chuji replied, equally bluntly, "There are means for preserving life, but no medicines for immortality." Counter to what you might have expected, at least publicly, Genghis Khan lauded Qiu Chuji for his honesty. For a man to travel such distance and hardship at his age, only to tell the world conqueror no, required quite some courage, and the Khan always respected that. The Khan was not yet finished with him though, and ordered him to have a tent pitched next to his own. They were to travel together higher into the valleys of the Hindu Kush to rest and wait out the summer heat, though uprisings took Genghis Khan away before he could speak with the master again. Qiu Chuji requested to return to Samarkand in the Khan's absence, which Genghis reluctantly agreed to, providing him a 1,000-man escort. As Genghis spent the next months putting down local rebellions, Qiu Chuji was again in the palace of Shah Muhammad, enjoying melons and bathing. By the end of August, Genghis Khan was ready for him and sent for Qiu Chuji. A particularly eerie detail mentioned is that while traveling south to rejoin Genghis, Qiu Chuji passed the ruins of the once great city of Balkh. Only dogs could be heard barking within. Genghis once more showed the master great respect and patience. Presented to Genghis by the minister Qinchai, Qiu Chuji was not required to bow or kneel before the Khan. When the Khan offered him airag, the traditional fermented mare's milk so beloved by the Mongols, Qiu Chuji refused to drink it. Every day the Khan invited Qiu Chuji to join him for dinner, and every day he declined, saying he preferred seclusion. The master told Genghis to keep his soldiers distant, for the noise annoyed him, and when the army moved north in the autumn of 1222 to winter near Samarkand, Qiu Chuji was given leave to take up in Shah Muhammad's palace once more. Over the course of this period, Genghis Khan and Qiu Chuji had several meetings. Qinchai and Liu Zhonglu present, the Khitan governor of Samarkand, Yelua Hai, acting as translator between Mongolian and Chinese. Together, they discussed the concepts of the Tao, Genghis supposedly being quite interested. Chu Chuji's disciple failed to provide specific details of these discussions, though we know he urged Genghis to show mercy on the Chinese, establish a buffer state in North China, and lift taxes for 3 years. In January 1223, their journey back east resumed, though the Taoist showed himself displeased with the progress of the army. By March, he was asking to set out on his own, hoping to return to his native Shandong before the end of the year. Genghis urged him to stay, saying his sons would soon arrive and would like to hear of the doctrine, and that he himself needed more information. Chu Chuji coolly replied that he had told the Khan everything he knew. Later that month, while hunting wild boar, Genghis Khan was thrown from his horse. The boar failed to charge and gore the Khan, avoiding the fate of Robert Baratheon. When he learned of this, Chu Chuji called it a warning from heaven, a sign that the Khan should give up hunting in his old age. Reluctantly, Genghis gave up this favorite activity for 2 months. Chu Chuji's advice on abstaining from sexual intercourse to prolong his life was likewise ignored. Continuing to badger Genghis to allow him to leave, the Khan finally acquiesced, and in April 1223, they separated. The master declined the gifts Genghis Khan offered, except for one, an edict declaring Taoists exempt from taxation and corvée labor. Chu Chuji returned to Yen, modern Beijing, in the first months of 1224, within 3 years as he had foretold. He spent the remainder of his life in that city, dying in August 1227, the same month as Genghis Khan. Spoiler, by the way. We just mentioned the edict proclaiming Taoists exempt from taxation. Well, part of the original edict was that no more Taoists would be ordained. This was followed up with a proclamation a few months later, making Chu Chuji the head of all the Taoists and Buddhists of China. The consequences of this were many. It's not sure what exact role Chu Chuji had in what followed, as he fell ill not long after he returned to Yen, and the Khan's edicts may have been taken advantage of by ambitious disciples. Almost immediately, this turned into thousands flocking into Chuanzhen temples to escape the taxation and forced labor of the Mongols. Likely, thousands of lives were saved through this, and Chuanzhen Taoism quickly became the most influential religious sect of North China. One scholar, Yuan Haowen, estimated that by the late 13th century, some 20% of northern Chinese were adherents. Even today, it remains one of the most popular forms of Taoism in China. A less positive outcome of the edict, however, was that the Khan's elevation of Chu Chuji's status over Buddhists turned into free license to confiscate Buddhist temples, destroy Buddhist artifacts and texts, and force the conversion of Buddhist monks and nuns. When Yellow Chucai, himself a Buddhist, returned to Yen in 1228, he was infuriated by what he found there and how the Chuanzhen had taken advantage of the privileges granted to them, compounding Chucai's existing dislike of Chu Chuji. Initially, they had been friendly, but Yellow Chucai soon found Chu Chuji to be totally ignorant of Buddhism and came to see him as a fraud, taking advantage of the Khan's generosity and power. In 1229, Yellow Chucai wrote a lengthy work criticizing Chu Chuji and his positions, while blaming himself for having encouraged the meeting. He further accused Chu Chuji of being fully complicit in the seizure and desecration of Buddhist temples, and it is in Chucai's account we are told that Chu Chuji died like Elvis, on the toilet, but his followers covered this up and said he died while at prayer. Yellow Chucai's work provides a fascinating counterbalance to the more hagiographic account of the journey provided by Chu Chuji's disciple, though Chucai's writing remains difficult to access, leaving Chu Chuji's reputation intact as a savior of the Chinese. The influence of Chuanzhen Taoism and its armed conflict with Buddhists continued until the reign of Genghis's grandson Kublai, when their privileges were drastically reduced and forced to return Buddhist temples. And just what did Genghis Khan think of Qiu Chuji? He seems to have enjoyed his company and would certainly have had respect for an old man who had made the long journey to his court. If he was disappointed in the failure of Qiu Chuji to provide an elixir of immortality, he did not show it publicly. Since the main account of these meetings was from a follower of Qiu Chuji, we must note that he had a vested interest to make the relationship between the two look as good as possible, securing Chuanzhen privileges as they were granted at the Khan's behest. On the internet, their relationship is famous for the following letter sent from Genghis to Qiu Chuji not long after their final meeting in 1223. You left me and set out on your travels in the spring, and were still on the road during the great heats of the summer. I hope you suffered no inconvenience and were well supplied with post horses. I hope that you were always provided with plenty to eat and drink and were never stinted. I hope the officials at Xuande and elsewhere treated you properly. Hope that the common people came to hear you. Are you well and in good spirits? Here I am, always thinking about you, O Holy Immortal. I have never forgotten you. Do not forget me. It is a little unbecoming for the world conqueror, making him appear rather desperate for Taoist's affection, like a high school student trying to win back his crush. There are two things to keep in mind, though. The most obvious is that this letter was sent in very basic and repetitive simple Chinese. Form-wise, it's totally alien to the literary flourishes, metaphors, and references from the writing of scribes like Yellow Chucai. Arthur Whaley suggested that because the Chinese is so basic, that perhaps this was Genghis Khan dictating it in Chinese. He had Chinese speakers in his entourage for well over a decade, meaning he had plenty of time to learn to make simple sentences in the language. So the letter may have come across particularly lovelorn because the Khan couldn't do much better than that. Second thing to keep in mind is Genghis Khan knew Qiu Chuji was a very popular figure in northern China. Getting Qiu Chuji to encourage his many followers across China to accept Mongol rule and pray for them may have been the Khan's ulterior motive throughout. Note how Genghis hopes the common people came to hear him spread the word of accepting Mongol rule, and to pray for them. Then the final line, I have never forgotten you, do not forget me. Well, it can be read as a rather sappy declaration. We might wonder if there was a threat hidden between the lines. Should Qiu Chuji choose to forget about the Khan and proclaim for the Jin dynasty, Genghis Khan and his men would not forget about him, and their arrows never missed their mark. Shortly after the departure of Qiu Chuji, Genghis Khan learned of the death of his general Mukhali in China, how Tangut forces had abandoned him and were now in peace talks with the Jurchen Jin. The aging Genghis Khan was about to partake on the final campaign of his long life. Be sure to subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast, Ages of Conquest, and to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. If you're unable to help financially, it would be hugely appreciated if you can leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts to help us grow and bring you more Mongols. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. We've now covered Genghis Khan's conquest of much of the Jin dynasty and the Khwarezmian Empire, leaving him with an empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. With the defeat of Jalal al-Din Mingburnu on the borders of India at the end of 1221, Genghis Khan began the long journey back to his homeland, much of this trip being discussed in our last episode, where we also discussed the Khan meeting the Taoist Qiu Chuji. Genghis Khan was certainly returning to his native steppe with an idea for continued campaigning in North China. hoping to deliver the death blow to the Jin dynasty. In his absence, his general Mughali, supported by Tengut forces, had been left to maintain pressure on the Jin until the Khan's return. Mughali's death in 1223 unraveled this plan, as it was followed by the ascension of new Jin and Tengut rulers, who organized peace between their respective empires. The treachery of his erstwhile vassals, the Tengut, had to be punished, while the succession of the aging Genghis had yet to be settled. Now, let us discuss the final years of Genghis Khan. I'm your host David, and this is the Ages of Conquest podcast, The Mongol Invasions. By the 1220s, Genghis Khan was in his 60s, having lived a long and difficult life. In the almost 20 years since he had unified the Mongols, a generation of new warriors had known nothing but his rule. The thought that Genghis could even die must have seemed impossible to many. The great success of the Khwarezm campaign had only demonstrated how Genghis Khan was heaven's chosen, and surely he was destined to conquer the remainder of the world. His impending demise, however, was something his top advisors were concerned over, and all knew the tendency for nomadic confederations to fragment on the ruler's death. You will recall that Genghis himself had taken advantage of the division of the Naiman Khanate between Taiyang and Buruk after their father's death in the 1190s. If the secret history of the Mongols is to be believed, the matter was brought up and settled on the eve of the Khwarezmian campaign, so in 1219, though other sources have it settled as late as on Genghis's deathbed. It's possible it was something that was dealt with in stages. Though Genghis had many children, with likely hundreds of lesser wives and concubines, there were only 4 choices over who would become Khan after his death, those born of his first and chief wife, Borte Khatun. The eldest of these was Jochi, a skilled hunter and capable commander. Infamously, Jochi was born after Borte's abduction by the Merkits in the 1180s. A haze therefore always hung over Jochi's legitimacy, and though Genghis Khan always publicly treated Jochi as his own, his second son, Chagadai, utterly refused to. Perhaps 2 years Jochi's junior, Chagadai was stern, a strict enforcer of his father's laws, and had an intense dislike for his older brother. Possibly by encouraging rumors of Jochi's illegitimacy, Chagadai hoped to increase his own chances of succeeding their father. Their conflict escalated and resulted in Genghis removing both from succeeding him as Great Khan, a decision made easier by Jochi's untimely death in 1225. The sources are unclear as to the reasons for his death, and cite anything from illness to injuries from a hunting accident to rumors that he was poisoned by Genghis himself. Genghis allowed Jochi's sons to inherit their father's territory, with Jochi's second son, Batu, succeeding him. The other 2 options to succeed Genghis were his third and fourth sons, Ogadai and Tului. Both were notable alcoholics, even by Mongolian standards, but where Tului built himself a reputation as a ruthless military commander, Ogadai was famously generous and conciliatory, a man capable of reaching compromise between the many loud voices of the empire. Unlike the less flexible Chagadai and Tului, Genghis anticipated Ogadai as having a head for establishing an actual administration rather than just expansion. Indeed, the intention may have been for Ogadai to be a ruler, not just a conqueror, though he would undoubtedly do that. If we're to believe the account in The Secret History of the Mongols, Chagadai himself suggested Ogadai as the best choice from among them. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia in spring of 1225, in what was to be a short stay in the land of his birth. As we've already mentioned, the general Mughali, with Tengut support, had campaigned against the Jin dynasty while Genghis was subduing the Khwarezmian Empire. With Mughali's death in early 1225, the Mongol offensive in China lost its impetus, though his son and brother continued to campaign. The Tengut abandoned the war, which was both hugely expensive and unpopular within their own kingdom. In similar time, the Jurchen Emperor Xuanzang of Jin died, succeeded by Aizong of Jin, and the Tangut king was forced to abdicate by his son, Weiming Dewang. With the slate wiped clean and the Great Khan still in Central Asia, the Jin and Tangut entered into negotiations and proclaimed a peace treaty and fraternal relations in 1225, a treaty with no provisions for military assistance, mind you. Organizing their own peace treaty with the Jin dynasty was, of course, an open refutation of the Great Khan's mandate, the culmination of a defiant trend that had started with their refusal to supply troops in 1219. Sitting comfy in our armchairs 800 years later with the benefit of hindsight, we know what a foolish decision this was. There was some sense to it from the Tangut point of view, though. With Muhali's death and Genghis still distant in the west, the Tangut gambled that the high tide of the Mongols had passed, the aging Genghis Khan burning out the last of his energies in Central Asia. The known tendency for nomadic confederations to splinter on their founder's demise, and the vast breadth of the Mongol Empire could have brought hopes of an approaching Mongolian civil war and breathing room for the Tangut. It turns out this was not a good gamble. On his return to Mongolia in 1225, Genghis Khan sent messengers to the Tangut court demanding they send a royal hostage to reaffirm their vassalage, an act the proud Tangut had never partaken in before. Mongol sources have the Tangut refused to provide this hostage and thus brought on Mongol wrath. However, we have two very rare and precious Tangut documents, a commander's report dated to 1225 and an early 14th century ritual song, which say the Tangut did provide a royal hostage, a prince who was less than 10 years old, who the Mongols promptly murdered. That this killing went unmentioned in Mongolian documents makes sense. Killing a royal hostage, an envoy, a child, was not a good look, especially when unprovoked, and even more when the Mongols tried using it to justify the invasion and destruction. If true, perhaps Genghis Khan was already set on attacking the Tangut, intending to use their refusal as casus belli, not anticipating they might actually comply. That the Tangut did actually send a child took the Mongol leadership by surprise and made it hard to justify an invasion, so they killed the boy, spread rumors the Tangut had refused, and proceeded with their invasion. In winter 1225, Genghis Khan left Mongolia for what would be the final time, marching at the head of an army into the Tangut Kingdom in January 1226. In these months, according to the secret history of the Mongols, Genghis Khan fell from his horse while hunting wild asses, the second such fall he suffered, with one a few years earlier mentioned in our episode on Chu Chi. This fall, however, was more serious. The elderly Khan developed a fever and was bedridden, and his captains argued that the army should fall back to allow Genghis to recover. The Tangut, in their pounded earth walls, would really not be going anywhere. Genghis refused, instead ordering a final set of envoys to meet the Tangut, and based off the response they received, Genghis would decide if they should retreat. Genghis's messengers reached the Tangut emperor, named Burchan by the Mongols, and shared the Khan's message as per the account in the secret history of the Mongols. You, Burchan, did not keep your promise and did not give me troops, but came out with mocking words. As I was moving in a different direction at the time, I said that I would call you to account later. I set out against Khwarazm, and being protected by eternal heaven, I brought them duly under submission. Now I have come to call Burchan to account for his words. Before the emperor could reply, the minister, Asagambu, spoke up, the man who had issued the rebuff to the Mongol requests for troops in 1219, and the same man dominating and leading the anti-Mongol faction in the Tangut court. I spoke the mocking words. As for now, if you Mongols who are used to fighting say, let us fight, then turn towards the Alishan mountains and come to me, for I have an encampment in the Alishan. When the messengers came to Genghis with Asagambu's response, the injured Khan made this declaration. This is enough. When one lets oneself be addressed so boastfully, how can one withdraw? Even if we die, let us challenge their boasts. Eternal heaven, you be the judge. Thus did Genghis Khan, suffering from internal injuries, remount his horse and ride into his final campaign. He had used his time wisely, developing a simple, perfectly executed strategy to ruin the Tangut. The western territory of the Tangut was taken methodically, preventing these garrisons from reuniting at the capital. Then, Mongol armies cut east, coming up behind the Alishan Mountains, and bypassing the defensive passes which had proved so troublesome in 1209. With their armies situated between the Tangut capital of Zhongxing and the Jin Empire, the Mongols cut the Tangut off from possible Jin support, investing the city while they reduced the other Tangut holdouts in the east of the kingdom. Everything went according to plan. The fortress of Karakoto, famous ruins today, fell in February 1226, and the western settlements fell in perfect succession. Tanguts in Mongol service, at times, managed to prevent slaughter or reach negotiated surrenders, but the bloodbath could not be averted. By that autumn, entire districts were surrendering to the Mongols, and then the Tangut emperor suddenly died, supposedly of fright. The reign of the kinsman who succeeded him was short and chaotic, watching helplessly as the 200-year-old Tangut kingdom was reduced to an ever-shrinking strip of land around the capital. In winter 1226, Genghis was outside Lingzhou, northeast of Shanxing. A Tangut army was sent from the capital, a desperate final gamble to kill the Khan and end the invasion. When the Yellow River froze, Genghis Khan crossed the river and destroyed the army. The final field battle Genghis Khan seems to have commanded in person. An army was then ordered to invest the Tangut capital, while Genghis moved to the kingdom's southeast, to Lintao, to mop up those untouched cities and act as a guard should Jin reinforcements come. By spring 1227, Genghis had secured most of the region, but the injuries sustained the year prior had not gone away. Whatever the injury had been, the year of campaign had prevented it from healing properly. Perhaps ribs had been broken in the fall and been unable to heal, and now infection was setting in, the Khan's old body failing him. To avoid the approaching heat of the summer and have a chance to rest, Genghis made his encampment high in the valleys of the Liupan Mountains. It was here that the Khan spent the last months of his life. The order of events of the Khan's final month, August 1227, are highly contradicted among the historical sources. Zhongxing resisted for 6 months before it finally surrendered in July or August, the Tangut ruler asking for a month to prepare gifts for the Khan. When Wei Mingxian came to surrender before the Khan's ger in August, he was forced to stand outside his ger for 3 days, quite likely because Genghis Khan had already died. What exactly killed Genghis Khan goes unspecified in the secret history of the Mongols, though it strongly suggests it was related to the injury from his earlier fall. By then, Genghis was in his late 60s and had gone through a life of injuries and rigor. Complications from internal injuries at that age in this period would hardly be an unusual way to die. Genghis is recorded as ordering the time, the cause of his death, and the very fact of it to remain secret. Had news of it reached the Tangut too early, they could have found new courage to continue and brought renewed resistance. Furthermore, dying before the campaign was actually completed could have been interpreted as heaven rescinding its favor. Coupled with Mongolian taboos about discussing death, it's almost a wonder we even learned he died at all. His generals proved loyal to him until the very end, and succeeded in keeping his death a secret. The true details around it were only known to a select audience of his commanders and family. The problem with this reasonable enough explanation is that it just wasn't sexy enough for the rumor mills of Asia, and in the absence of an official explanation, we are provided with a litany of different variations in every medieval source which mentions it. The Persian writers Giovanni, Rashid al-Din, and the Ming-era Yuan Shi speak of illness aggravated by the climate, while the Syriac writer Bar Hebraus specified malaria. The Franciscan friar John de Plano Caprini thought Genghis was killed by lightning, And Marco Polo said Genghis died of an infection from a Tangut arrow to the knee. He used to be an adventurer, after all. A later Mongolian tradition from the 17th century said that Genghis was severely injured during coitus with a captured Tangut princess, who had cleverly hidden a knife in her body somewhere. We'll let you fill in the blanks on that one. Whatever the specifics, Genghis Khan died in August 1227, with August 18th or 25th commonly given as dates in the sources. The Tangut king was left standing for 3 days, for which the Mongols gave him the ironic name of Shidurhu, meaning upright. With Shidurhu's death, Mongol forces rode down upon the unsuspecting Shanxing, which was subject to fire and plunder. Though some were rescued by Tanguts in Mongol service, Shanxing was obliterated, the vast pyramidal tombs of the Tangut kings looted and stripped of their tiles. These still stand today, barren, eroding memorials to a lost kingdom. The secret history of the Mongols treats the Tangut with nothing but scorn, this passage illustrating this. After he had plundered the Tangut people and making Iluhu Burkhan change his name to Sidurhu, had done away with him, and after having exterminated the Tangut people's mothers and fathers down to the offspring of their offspring, maiming and taming Genghis Khan, gave the following order. While I take my meals, you must talk about the killing and destruction of the Tangut and say, maimed and tamed, they are no more. The Tangut kingdom ceased to exist in August 1227, an escort for Genghis Khan to the afterlife. Temujin had entered the world clutching a blood clot in his fist, and Genghis Khan left it with the blood of kingdoms on his hands. The Tangut people were scattered, their official records burned along with Shanxing. It was not, however, a total genocide, as we know several Tangut cities surrendered without issue, with communities spread across China and the Mongol Empire. Tanguts would actually enjoy higher ranking than even Khitans and Jurchen under the Yuan dynasty later in the century, as the Tangut were seen as less Sinicized than them. Genghis Khan's body was, according to contemporary accounts, returned to Mongolia beside an honor guard, buried most likely on Mount Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain which had provided him shelter in his childhood and not far from place of birth. The grave was kept small and hidden, trees supposedly planted to hide it, and the entire region placed under guard and forbidden to enter. Even today, the area is called the Ich Horig, the Great Taboo, and only the most limited of non-intrusive scientific surveys have been undertaken in the area. There are, of course, other variations to the story, such as the caravan becoming stuck in the Ordos Desert. In the Ordos, during the Qing dynasty, a shrine was built to honor the Khan's spirit, the cause of some misconception today that he was literally buried there. Other rumors mentioning the killing of every individual the funeral cortege came Horig, the Great Taboo, and only the most limited of non-intrusive scientific surveys have been undertaken in the area. There are, of course, other variations to the story, such as the caravan becoming stuck in the Ordos Desert. In the Ordos, during the Qing dynasty, a shrine was built to honor the Khan's spirit, the cause of some misconception today that he was literally buried there. Other rumors mentioning the killing of every individual the funeral cortege came across. Human sacrifice is not mentioned with Genghis's immediate burial, but a few years later, his son Ogadai sent 40 maidens for his father's soul. Beyond that, we know almost nothing about the details. Inference, based off of what we know of the burials of later Khans, are hard to apply to Genghis, as these later burials had influence from sedentary cultures, though many Mongol Khans and notables would be buried on Burkhan Khaldun in the following 2 centuries. So ends the life of Genghis Khan, founder of the Mongol Empire, conqueror of much of Eurasia, and flail of God. His death was met by sorrow among his people, cheers from peoples across Asia, and bated breath by the empire's neighbors, waiting to see what would come next. Genghis's third son, Ogadai, was to succeed his father, inheriting a powerful, experienced, and loyal army staffed by generals and officers who believed it was their destiny to ride over everything under the eternal blue sky. Once a young boy abandoned by his tribe, Genghis had, over time, forged his people into a weapon, by the end of his life approaching the status of a demigod among them. Today, Mongolians cherish him as the founder of their nation, and his reign was a turning point in Eurasian history. Kingdoms across the world were washed away by his armies, and an unprecedented era of Eurasian integration was to be ushered in by his successors. Could Ögedei live up to Genghis's legacy, or would he be lost in the shadow of a man which could blot out the sun? And making Illuhu Burhan change his name to Sidurhu had done away with him, and after having exterminated the Tangut people's mothers and fathers down to the offspring of their offspring, maiming and taming Genghis Khan, gave the following order: "While I take my meals, you must talk about the killing and destruction of the Tangut and say, 'Maimed and tamed, they are no more.'" The Tangut kingdom ceased to exist in August 1227, an escort for Genghis Khan to the afterlife. Temujin had entered the world clutching a blood clot in his fist, and Genghis Khan left it with the blood of kingdoms on his hands. The Tangut people were scattered, their official records burned along with Zhanxing. It was not, however, a total genocide, as we know several Tangut cities surrendered without issue, with communities spread across China and the Mongol Empire. Tanguts would actually enjoy higher ranking than even Khitans and Jurchen under the Yuan dynasty later in the century, as the Tangut were seen as less Sinicized than them. Genghis Khan's body was, according to contemporary accounts, returned to Mongolia beside an honor guard, buried most likely on Mount Burhan Khaldun, the mountain which had provided him shelter in his childhood and not far from place of birth. The grave was kept small and hidden, trees supposedly planted to hide it, and the entire region placed under guard and forbidden to enter. Even today, the area is called the Ich Horig, the Great Taboo, and only the most limited of non-intrusive scientific surveys have been undertaken in the area. There are, of course, other variations to the story, such as the caravan becoming stuck in the Ordos Desert. In the Ordos, during the Qing dynasty, a shrine was built to honor the Khan's spirit, the cause of some misconception today that he was literally buried there. Other rumors mentioning the killing of every individual the funeral cortege came across. Human sacrifice is not mentioned with Genghis's immediate burial, but a few years later, his son Ögedei sent 40 maidens for his father's soul. Beyond that, we know almost nothing about the details. Inference, based off of what we know of the burials of later Khans, are hard to apply to Genghis, as these later burials had influence from sedentary cultures, though many Mongol Khans and notables would be buried on Burhan Khaldun in the following 2 centuries. So ends the life of Genghis Khan, founder of the Mongol Empire, conqueror of much of Eurasia, and flail of God. His death was met by sorrow among his people, cheers from peoples across Asia, and bated breath by the empire's neighbors, waiting to see what would come next. Genghis's third son, Ögedei, was to succeed his father, inheriting a powerful, experienced, and loyal army staffed by generals and officers who believed it was their destiny to ride over everything under the eternal blue sky. Once a young boy abandoned by his tribe, Genghis had, over time, forged his people into a weapon, by the end of his life approaching the status of a demigod among them. Today, Mongolians cherish him as the founder of their nation, and his reign was a turning point in Eurasian history. Kingdoms across the world were washed away by his armies, and an unprecedented era of Eurasian integration was to be ushered in by his successors. Could Ögedei live up to Genghis's legacy, or would he be lost in the shadow of a man which could blot out the sun? The continued expansion of the Mongol Empire is the topic of our next episodes, so be sure to subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast, Ages of Conquest. And to continue helping us bring you more outstanding content, please visit our Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. If you're unable to help financially but still want to support us, it would be highly appreciated if you can leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts to help us grow and bring you more Mongols. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one. The crowd that had assembled was mighty. The princes, sons, and generals from across the Mongol Empire had collected on the Harowin River in September 1229 to elect Ogadai, third son of Genghis Khan, as Khan of Khans. From the line of Ogadai's late brother Jochi,